Good afternoon, and welcome to our second EDI in Focus session running as part of BFI FAN. We have quite a lot of people just entering the webinar at the moment, so we'll give it just a minute and then we'll get started. So I'm Nicola Kettlewood, I'm the manager of Film Hub Scotland. I'm just here to introduce our chair for this afternoon, who is Charlie Little. So Charlie is EDI champion for BFI FAN, and this is the second of the webinars that she's organised for us. They've also created the accessible guidelines, which are really useful, and hope that you can access them. They're available probably through your local FAN hub, or you can also go to the Film Hub Scotland website, which is filmhubscotland.com, and in our access resources, that information's all there. Okay, so Charlie, I'm going to pass over to you. I think most of our audience is here, and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nicola. Just to start off with, if you would like to access the live captioning, you should be able to just enable CC. If you're having any problems, just put it in the chat, and one of our staff will be able to try look into that. I'm just going to start sharing my slides now, and hopefully it goes smoothly. Just bear with. Okay. Sorry about that. Just give me a second. Oh, there we go. So hopefully, I think you can all see that now. My slides on the screen. Yes. So welcome to the second webinar of the BFI FAN, Quality, Diversity, and Inclusion in Focus. And this session is going to be focusing on intersectional audiences, what intersectionality is, the barriers that these audiences face, and how exhibitors can welcome diverse intersectional audiences. And I'm really happy to be joined by two wonderful speakers, and I'll go on to introduce them in a second. As Nicola said, my name is Charlie Little. My pronouns are she, they, and I'll just provide a visual self-description. So I'm a white person in their mid-20s. I'm almost 26 in a couple of days. I have shoulder length-ish, curly, dark blonde hair, and like a wolf cut, and I'm wearing a black sweater. And I am an in-house access consultant with Matchbox Cine in the Film Hub Scotland EDI champion, supporting FAN on access and inclusion for deaf and disabled audiences. I'm hard of hearing myself and partially sighted, and very much bring my lived experiences as a disabled queer moviegoer to my work as an access consultant. There'll be time at the end for questions and resource sharing, but do feel free to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function, and one of us will be able to bring it up. And you can also use the chat if you want to share comments or experiences with everyone else. So to go on to our wonderful speakers, first of all, we have the amazing Kyla Harris, who is a filmmaker, writer, activist, who very much uses an intersectional approach to all of their work. They're also the chair of the BFI Disability Screen Advisory Group that advises and supports inclusivity in the film industry. And Kyla very much advocates for people who share her own identity as a queer disabled person of color. Through Filmmakers with Disability, or Forward Doc, they co-wrote an amazing toolkit on inclusion and access in association with Doc Society and Netflix, and also worked on the Forward Doc engagement pack. And I don't know if you're finished now, Kyla, but you've been working on a television series that you are starring in and that you co-wrote for BBC. yeah, not sure if you are finished now, but yeah, please say hi and provide a self-description if you're able to.
Thanks for that embarrassing intro, Charlie. I also identify, I loved how you said what did you say, that you were a queer disabled moviegoer? I like how that moviegoer is an identity now.
Absolutely.
So yeah, my name is Kyla Harris. I have dark, kind of 70s long black hair. I have light brown skin. I'm wearing a kind of reddish lipstick, and I'm wearing a very cozy twin set in beige knit wear.
Gorgeous.
And yes, the television series is called We Might Regret This. It's going to be out on BBC Two in the fall, and it has been officially signed off. It is out of my hands. So yeah.
Congratulations, Kyla. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we also have Linnea Petterson, who is a freelancer working in cinema and film exhibition and is Film Hub Wales socio-economic champion, supporting the fan membership on engaging audiences who face socio-economic barriers. Have spent a decade working in curation and audience development and project management, focusing on schools and young audiences. You're working on project aimed at improving access for people who have barriers when accessing moviegoing, and you've been developing campaigns and events to support releases to reach and engage underserved communities. Please say hi and provide a self-description if you're able to.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for that, Charlie. So I am a white woman with longish dark brown hair, brown eyes, big nose, and yeah, I am wearing a black top. I've got I'll shout out the sleeve tattoo that is just in there. And yeah, I'm 33, but I still get ID'd. So I'll take that. Yeah, that's me.
Always shout out the sleeve. Thank you so much. We only have a limited amount of time to talk today, but we very much want to have a more conversational approach. And I suppose we should kind of get into what does intersectionality actually mean, and I'll talk about my own understandings, and Linnea and Kyla will talk about their experiences as well. But to just kind of begin, it's a term that's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it very much describes how different systems of inequality based on marginalized identities such as disability, race, sexual orientation, gender, and so on, how these can intersect. For example, a queer disabled woman would have unique and different experiences from a queer non-disabled woman. And I think it's really important that in terms of understanding intersectionality, this therefore supports us being able to more deeply understand the complexities and nuances of intersectional discriminations and privilege. And we can't really untangle our identities, and there's not necessarily one singular demographic to work from. And different forms of discrimination, depending on your identities, can't necessarily be separated. I suppose I also wanted to mention the disability justice model, which is a social justice movement that focuses on looking at disability and ableism, but also how they relate to other forms of oppression and identity, including class, gender, race, and what I've mentioned before. But yeah, I suppose I wanted to ask you, Kyla, your kind of understanding of intersectionality and how you practice that.
Mega questions.
I know.
That's like a mic drop question. So I think identity and identity politics are talked about a lot now, which I think is very exciting. They certainly weren't talked a lot about when as much when I was younger, or certainly not in, I certainly wasn't engaged with them in the 80s because I was a child. But I think in coming to understand my own identities and really live fully in them, I've understood intersectionality more. And for me, that really means that if I'm in a room with a bunch of disabled people, you know, I can still experience racism if you know it's a room full of white people, white disabled people. Disabled people can be racist too. And then if I'm in a room of people of color or Black people, some of them can be ableist, and I can experience ableism then. So I think it's really about wanting to be seen for your whole self. Considering that we have so many, yeah. So I was also actually had a conversation with a disabled person of color not long ago and experienced homophobia. So, you know, it's a bit of a identity minefield. But I really love and kind of celebrate intersectionality through a disability lens, and specifically through disability justice. I really, really live by those principles in my work and in my personal life. And I think in my work, it's really about recognizing that we are all multifaceted and looking at everyone holistically. And even though I am also part of all of these different identities, that I also don't know everything about being a person of color, and I also don't know every disabled person's experience, and that I, you know, don't experience probably as much homophobia as someone who is you know, transgender. And it's just all very, it's a very complex, I was going to say rug of life, but I really don't think, like, I was more thinking weaving, I don't know, a woven tapestry of life when it comes to identities. And I think it's really rich. And I think that it brings a lot to conversations around who can access what, and access in a very holistic way, when it comes to, again, yeah, I think Linnea's work in terms of like socio-economic access and ways that identities can affect that.
Yeah, amazing. And I very much have, as I've gotten older and I've become more comfortable in my queer identity and gender identity, and seeing how that intersect, but also very much recognizing that my experiences as a white disabled person are very different to that of, you know, Black people or people of color that are disabled. So, and just how many nuances there are. Linnea, I suppose, yeah, I wanted to go on to you and kind of your understanding, and also in relation to socio-economic data.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I definitely agree, Kyla. And I was heading down the woven tapestry with you. Like, I get it.
Not the rug. Stay away from the rug.
I think intersectionality is important in terms of also recognizing privileges that are afforded by different aspects of your identity, and how in different, you know, in different contexts and different times of your life, that different parts of your identity can feel more magnified or not as magnified. And it's about understanding, yeah, for me personally, as a white woman, understanding my privileges that come from that identity in relation to the other aspects of my identity in terms around mental health, around class, socio-economic background and things like that. I think it is important, yeah, that class and socio-economic background is now being brought into this conversation, where it potentially hadn't been brought up as much before, or at least not officially, not as something that was targeted, and you know, projects being set up to address it. But yeah, because class, you know, and we'll talk about this soon, it has such profound impacts on people of particular marginalized identities. You know, it emphasizes and it can highlight and some work that's intersectional work, and there are different types of intersectional work that's out there, that's done, that have positives and negatives to them, pros and cons. Yeah, with some intersectional work doesn't necessarily lean into understanding class and how that might impact someone's experience. So yeah, I'm thankful that that's part of the conversation now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much both for your kind of introductory thoughts. I'm just going to go on to kind of talking a bit more about the barriers that we might come across when it comes to film exhibition for intersectional audiences. And just to go off on what you were saying, Linnea, about socio-economic status, I know that, you know, we'll kind of give on to affordability, but for example, disabled people are far more likely to experience poverty and or unemployment, and we know that ticket pricing is a barrier to so many audiences. And if a cinema has standard access provisions such as captioned showings, or are really focusing on their wheelchair access, we know that there still will be many disabled people who won't be able to attend the cinema just because of £13 pricing tickets. But yeah, I suppose if you wanted to talk a bit more about the affordability aspect of film exhibition and how that's been a barrier.
Yeah, of course. And I think there are some fantastic examples from over the last few years that I've been working to address affordability of tickets. You have festivals like Squiff in Scotland, so the Scotland Queer International Film Festival, and the sliding scale ticketing model that has been so effective there. You can see the reports on the Inclusive Cinema website. If you check that out, there'll be some resources sent out later that can help reassure organisations, venues, festivals that taking steps into using a sliding scale ticketing model or a pay what you can afford model doesn't have to be so scary, and that it's just another entry point for people where affordability is an issue. I think I'd also say that around affordability, when we're talking about socioeconomic status and class, and you know, there's a lot to unpick there, because with working class people, it's not necessarily that affordability is the issue. You know, my 20-year-old nephew earns a heck of a lot more than I do working on site. And so with that, you know, affordability is one part of the issue, and there are things that you can do about that, but there are also other elements that need to be taken into consideration, where when we're talking about class, it's not just, you know, that they can't afford a ticket, but it might be around value of the experience and not quite knowing what they're going to get from it. So there's a lot kind of baked into that. But just to cycle on back to you know, what we were talking about earlier with cost of tickets and pricing. Obviously, as cost of living crisis now, there are millions of people living in poverty. We can't have a conversation about socioeconomic status without talking about poverty. You know, it affects millions of people across the UK, and within that working class section of people, you have incredibly diverse people from various backgrounds, race, ethnicity. And what was that I was reading earlier around, you know, there's so much at play in the cost of living crisis where people can't afford to feed themselves in a day. So when we're talking about affordability and understanding what people are using their money for, how they're spending it, you know, before they even get to the point of being able to afford to go to a cultural event, there's just the day-to-day living costs of being able to feed yourself and your family, let alone pay for the petrol to get into town if you've got a car, or to pay for transport to get to a venue. Yeah, there's a lot in there that's that's quite serious that I don't, I've been talking to a lot of people over the last few months, and there is a little bit of it's not an avoidance of this issue, but I guess if you don't live it, you don't understand how serious it can get. And it's the fact that there are millions of people who are in this situation. That where I think it was among the poorest households, there are families that would have to spend up to 74% of their disposable income just to be meeting the Eat Well guidelines, and to be eating a balanced diet. So yeah, I realize I'm going off a little bit there in terms of cinema tickets, but just to kind of set a little state of the nation kind of thing. Like, there are millions of people in your communities that can't afford to feed themselves from day to day. And it disproportionately affects communities of colour, disabled people.
Yeah, no, I think that's so insightful, Linnea, and I think it's so important to, first of all, understand the situation before we can then go on to look into solutions for those situations. I think in terms of programming, I think exhibitors not programming diverse stories is a huge barrier, and being able to welcome audiences who they know they're going to be able to relate to, but not just the stories themselves, but sometimes cultural events that have speakers, and consistently being able to welcome diverse speakers, and not just to talk about diverse things. Not just inviting a disabled person to speak on a film about disability. There's so many other more interesting topics, and not just kind of reducing someone to their identity, and in terms of inviting them to and platforming them as well. I think another thing that I see is only awareness days being used to celebrate intersectional stories. We'll have, for example, International Day of Disabled Person. Great, we'll put on freaks, and that's it for the rest of the year. And I think it's just about expanding beyond that, and kind of embedding diversity and as part of the actual programming, and in turn, hopefully, that will lead to kind of welcoming those audiences as well. I think we all want to be able to relate to screen stories, but I think the distinction is that intersectional audiences don't necessarily only want to watch films about their identities. For example, I always get if there's a new film that's come out about a deaf person, everyone tells me about it. They'll say I'll love it, but I don't necessarily hear about other films. But yeah, I thought, Kyla, I wondered if you have any thoughts, especially as a filmmaker yourself, and your kind of perspective on programming.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much nuance and complexity around these conversations too, especially like around programming and identities. And I think it is such a vicious circle, because there are so many, there are so few disabled filmmakers getting their work commissioned and, being able to be viewed, that when I hear about a film about disability, I'm like, yes, I'm going to watch it, even if it's just adding another kind of click onto the amount of attendees. But I think as well, it's really like, I would rather have someone who's disabled, and I'm not saying this is what you were suggesting, Charlie, but like talk about a disabled film than a non-disabled person talk about a disabled film. And I also feel like the idea of being reduced to an identity is an interesting concept in itself, because really, in a sense, like I'm happy to be reduced to my identities. I'm happy to talk about my identities at length, and how there's, so much rich culture that I have in them, and so much community that brings so much joy because of them. And I think that all of the communities that we've been talking about, or people who are facing systemic barriers, we're just really not represented in an authentic and a nuanced way, really. And I think that then because of that, a lot of people who are within those communities probably aren't then drawn to seeing themselves poorly represented, you know? So I think it is a bit of a vicious cycle that needs to be broken a bit. But I think, again, like a lot of the barriers that are being faced are because we're not looking at people holistically. We're not looking at people wholly. We're not thinking about intersectionality when we're talking about programming and venues and transport and affordability. We're not thinking about that as a system. I think there are a lot of people doing really fantastic work. I think it's like Film Hub Wales is doing a really fantastic job, and I know there's a venue in Bristol that's doing amazing work. But it's kind of like, and all of the resources out there, you know, all of this knowledge, all of the information that could help reduce barriers for people is out there. I think it's also about raising awareness that this is important, that this should be a priority, and that arts and culture are one of the best and most exciting things about living in the UK, you know. As someone who's Canadian and grew up in Canada, and, you know, I've lived here for 14 years, that's what drew me here, was the rich kind of arts and culture that we do have to offer. And I think when you're so involved in the day-to-day of that, we forget that. And I think, yeah. So I think it's about reminding people of the rich diversity we have and the rich cultures we have that is on screen and available, and encouraging people to get involved.
And if I could add to that, looking at films and in terms of representation and telling people's stories authentically is a massive part of programming, but also when you're looking at audiences, and in terms of socioeconomic status, I'll just pull that one in, like that it's looking at, they call it the C2DE way of measuring audiences, so by occupation, and these are those that work, you know, semi-manual routine jobs or are out of work for whatever reason, long-term sick. When you're looking at research into the kinds of films that people from those groups like to watch, it's also just escapism and having a good time. And when, you know, so it's getting that balance right between representation, but also giving people a chance to jump out of their life for a bit. And again, I think that, like what you were saying, Kyla, when you live this work every day, and you're always talking about film, you're involved in all these conversations. You know, if I go back to where I grew up, there weren't many people having these conversations with me about film. You'd be the oddball, like, if you were there talking about independent world cinema. So yeah, it's important to include that desire for the cinema experience to escape and to have some fun. Because when you're looking at audiences that might only go to the cinema going has dropped amongst that section of audience. If you're looking at people who go to the cinema once or twice a year, you know, it's what is the thing that is going to hook them into coming to the cinema? And that might be a bigger name blockbuster, but then how do you speak to those people while you've got them, to introduce them to who you are, your values as an organization, a venue, and introduce them to the rest of your program as well and what you're about? So, and for me, that always comes back to talking to the communities that are in your area that you're wanting to engage with, and find out what they want from you and your venue. What are they looking for? And then open up that conversation, because that it doesn't happen as much as it could. And the organisations that do that work, they're amazing ones. I was chatting with Antisocial in Blackpool the other day. They do such incredible work, intersectional work, and it is all based around talking to their communities, the people in Blackpool. They know who lives where by postcode, and it's getting down to that hyper local level. They've been able to understand their audiences, their communities, their potential audiences, and what they want. So shout out to those guys, because they are smashing it.
Yeah, we can include them in our resource list that we send out afterwards. Yeah, I think in terms of programming, and I worked on BFI funding the Bias Festival last year, which is a disability-centric film festival, and down at BFI South Bank, and I had the pleasure to program for it as well. And being able to screen stories just about disability and have disabled speakers, and then the reception afterwards, it was the kind of first time I felt so much disability joy, but also kind of like intersectionally as well. And it was just the most amazing feeling, and I wish I could replicate that again and again. And I wish other exhibitors near me could replicate that feeling. It was fantastic. Maybe with the wine, I don't know, but
I was there for it. The programming was fantastic, and there was so much joy, and the wine was also helpful. But no, there was so much there. I think that like you did such a good job of creating such a range of films, from animations, short animations to docs, to narrative work. So it was like there was something for everyone. And I think because all of them related to disability, whether the film was about disability or not, it was either from a disabled person or about disability, or both. It still felt really cohesive. And I think that's really important as well, is that there is, because there is so much variety within these communities as well. I think it's good you can have something that speaks to everyone, but have it still feel cohesive.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about this forever and ever, but just to kind of go on to some of their points, I think in terms of exhibitors' communications, I think something that comes up for me anyways a lot is just inaccessible marketing. So this is kind of about taking more of a holistic approach to access, and not just thinking about, is the film screening with descriptive subtitles, is it screening with AD, but thinking, well, how are we actually communicating this to audiences in an accessible way, in a way that maybe suits their access needs. I often have come across outreach efforts where there's a film that's screening with audio description, and they want to do outreach with blind focused charities or blind members of the community, but they're sending images that don't have an image description, or they're sending a trailer that doesn't have audio description. But I think that is often something that comes up, and not like connecting the audience journey to discovering and attending as well. I think also extending on from that, I think staff training in all kind of areas of EDI is essential to creating a welcoming environment where audiences want to return. And I think also inclusive language as well. I have been referred to a few times as the blind lady, which is not well, I don't really identify as a lady, and it, but it's just things like that. But that stays in my mind. That makes me not necessarily want to return to places. And I think I have, for people that don't understand the context, I use a white cane for my sight loss. So it's very much obvious to sighted people when I approach them, and there's a look of panic on their face. And that can be really alienating and make me not want to return to cultural spaces. So I think staff awareness and awareness in general across the sector is essential to kind of creating that audience reliability and trust as well. I wonder if any of you, either of you have anything you want to kind of share in that regards.
Yeah, I think what you said about the blind lady, I think that's definitely being reduced to your identity in like a negative way. I think it's, yeah. But I used to hold like community film events in Brighton, because that's where I live. And I think one of the things that we decided to do was go quite old school as well. We just had like a range of different communications. So we'd have like a Facebook event, we'd have you know, like an email send out, and but we also like did flyers and went flyering and like went around Brighton. And so for people who don't have computers or smartphones or whatever, that they could see out in the community that there were these events and kind of recognize them that way as well. So that we would target, yeah, people who don't have kind of access to computers and technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'd add around communications and thinking about film copy and the stuff that you're putting out to audiences that might not be super familiar with all the language and the terms that are used. And I mean, I don't mean like you have to dumb it down. It's not like that kind of thing, but I have a degree, but if you need to have a degree to understand what this film is about, you're cutting off people that can't read at that level, you know, can't remember the exact figure, but the reading age of the UK, average reading age was about 9 years old. I hope I have not just grossly misrepresented that data, but it's you know, it's thinking about what you're saying, who you're saying your films and events are for in the language that you're using. And yeah, if you start chucking out paragraphs about a film that, yeah, you have to pick apart and analyze before you can understand what the film's about, yeah, you're creating a barrier there for people who might not be quite on the same level in terms of like film literacy as you. Yeah.
No, that's a really important point that I hadn't necessarily was going to raise. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think before I move on to the next slide, I just kind of wanted to mention, you know, people thinking about their venue space, both in terms of physical accessibility, but I also wanted to mention, you know, thinking about like gender neutral toilets and also kind of like heteronormative or kind of not gender inclusive language and signage as well. And I've often been told that the disabled toilet, or rather I would call the accessible toilet, is the gender neutral toilet. And I think people are just not really understanding the need for these spaces and their different purposes for different people. But also, yeah, like I say, just thinking about the accessibility of your venue and the kind of welcoming nature of that, and staff does go into that as well, and their confidence. And in terms of transport, and then Linnea already mentioned it before, but thinking about the audience journey, and like some people have to pay for taxis or buses or train, and I think exhibitors need to maybe think about that as well. And you know, if you have like late night screenings, how are you getting people? How are people safely getting home? And the expenses that may come with that. You know, it's amazing to have like kind of atmospheric late night screenings, especially for a horror film. But depending on the area and the locality, how are people getting home? Yeah, I think those are just things that aren't necessarily thought about, and how some people, depending on their identities, might feel differently about their journeys home in terms of safety as well. yeah, do either of you have anything to kind of add on, especially in terms of like collaboration, before I kind of move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I suppose we haven't talked yet about viewing online and having some kind of online viewing platform along with being able to go to a cinema as well. I feel like in some cases it's, I mean, well, anytime possible, I think it's really good to be able to have that available too. And I know that now people are kind of thinking that we're out of COVID and they want to get out more, and that's great for a lot of people. But you know, even for myself, like I don't go to films in the evening because my energy levels are usually pretty low in the evening. So it's a lot of effort and difficulty to get out and sustain those hours, you know, out of the house or not in bed. So I think that whenever, you know, we have all of the technology now of how to stream from home, even if, you know, if there's also a program that where there's a Q&A afterwards in the cinema, like also still having a way of live streaming that. We have all of the technology. And I think it's really important to have that as an option and a possibility as well.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. And I think the pandemic was the only time where I was able to go to as many accessible screenings and film festivals than I ever had in my life, and I still don't now. It was the only time because I watch everything with descriptive subtitles, and I think online activity for a huge number of reasons is still something that exhibitors could maybe look into if they have the capacity, because I think the audiences are there. It's just a kind of case of marketing and capacity and things like that, but it is hugely important. Linnea, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think as well, thinking about people who work shift work and on, you know, your non-traditional like 9 to 5 working patterns, anything that happens at like 7:30 in the evening, you know, lots of people working then, people working in bars, hospitality, you know, Deliveroo, etc. Other things are fortunately available. But yeah, you have people working all sorts of hours where, you know, things are programmed as like key slots. So trying to find ways to work around that and mitigate that if there is online access. And also there are data banks and things like that, which can provide people with data. You know, again, millions of households can't afford adequate communication data packages. Yeah, having that kind of information available is also really useful for the communities that you work with if you do have online stuff going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked with festivals that had a designated kind of data bursary and things like that. And then,
Yeah,
so,
and if there's the option to set up screens like somewhere in venue where people can just chill out and watch stuff. I haven't used the ones at the BFI, the screening room, but I quite like that idea of having a space where people can catch up at any time and access films and they're still in the venue, but at a time that suits them.
yeah, absolutely. I think just like I say, I wish I could just sit here and talk to you both for hours, but I suppose, and we already touched on some of the kind of things that exhibitors can do to welcome diverse and intersectional audiences, and we spoke about programming intersectional stories that isn't tokenistic and goes beyond an awareness day. And like we say, and like, well, Kyla was saying that, you know, having disabled speakers and disabled filmmakers will bring that community because that is bringing authenticity, and that will work across other identities as well, intersectional identities. And I suppose there's, you know, a wealth of resources out there. And, you know, even just thinking off the top of my head in terms of programming, I know Oscar Bright have a program of queer disabled stories. I think Kyla, do correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's called Freedom. The season is called Freedom or something like that, but I'll send it in the resource list afterwards. And you know, I'm based in Edinburgh, so I think about the Scottish Queer International Film Festival, which have a very intersectional approach, especially on access and queer storytelling. So you know, the content's out there. It's just about engaging with it. And also doing outreach with intersectional groups is hugely important. Some examples off the top of my head is Deaf Rainbow UK, Para Pride. I know in Scotland there's the Scottish Ethnic Minority Deaf Charity. There's groups out there, and I think doing meaningful outreach and connecting with these groups beyond just one of those email blasts, I think is really important to extend your hand, because we know that intersectional audiences have been so underserved, and we're not necessarily just going to be waiting at our laptops or waiting at the door. You need to kind of extend your hand first, I would say. I think having like an EDI action plan or strategy and working on that and making it public and going through the process of working on that, and also has accountability. I think it's hugely important that it's not just, okay, we've done this and we don't have to ever think about access or intersectionality again, but it's something that we know we have to constantly work on. And I think that that's brilliant. I don't think that's a bad thing or a chore to be seen as a negative. It's exciting that we are kind of expanding our knowledge and engagement with intersectional audiences. I'm waffling a bit now, but I wonder if either of you wanted to kind of to chip in on any of the kind of points I've mentioned, or yeah, anything that you think exhibitors could maybe look at or be aware of.
Yes. Sorry, Kyla, I saw you going. Do you want to go first?
I'll be really quick anyway, because I think a lot of this has to do, like a lot of what we're talking about underneath everything that we're saying is your own awareness of disability, race, gender, socioeconomic status, class. You know, I think it's doing your own work as well to really understand the identities and perspectives of these peoples and the barriers that we face, so that we are kind of also giving you some, you know, like broad strokes here and some guidelines and some anecdotes. But I think if people don't understand that within themselves and try and kind of unlearn what they've been taught through really harmful media, and, you know, then I think that you can't really come from a place of doing anything with longevity and sustainability and true heart. And I think that's important.
Mic drop.
Employ people. Employ people. Employ a wide and diverse range of people in your organization and work with them. I think my approach is always to start with the communities, to get out there and talk to people. If you haven't got the time to talk to the people that you're trying to engage, you need to you need to rethink how you're prioritizing your time, because kind of like you were saying, the knowledge is out there and it's with the people who are living these lives within 30 minutes of your venue or your organization. So talk to them, research postcode data. Like, that's one thing. I think data can be useful if it's used properly. You know, if you're getting people to fill in a feedback form and then you're just going, 25% of this audience identify as disabled. What are you doing with that data? And what about all those other parts of their identity that you just kind of ignored? So I think in how we collect data and how we evaluate, how we reflect needs to change. And I think there's bold claims here, but I do. I think if your data isn't being useful for you going forward and making setting down aims that align with your values, what are you collecting that data for? And yeah, I think whenever I did feedback forms, I would always throw in extra questions to enrich the data so I could understand better where these people were coming from. And even if you can't submit that data to the people who funded whatever, you can use that data and you're getting valuable insights into the people that are using your venue. If you can, go out to estates, go and talk to people. Again, the organisations I've talked with that are doing such incredible work in this area are going out to communities and talking to them, building trust that way. And if you don't have the time, there are organisations and community groups that are doing that work. It's about building trust with those guys so that you're not just going out and mining data, you're actually showing that you're committed to providing a place where these people can come and feel welcome and included, and build a relationship with you. So yeah, there's a lot. It's not easy work, guys. We know that. But
But it should take the work, if these audiences have been so underserved, it takes the work. And you should genuinely want to have, bring these films to the widest audience possible. That's what we're all here for at the end of the day. We've all experienced, not to be cheesy, but the first time I felt comfortable in an accessible screening, and I was far too old. I was about 17, and it was bittersweet because it was amazing. The first time I felt really included and got to fully enjoy the cinematic experience, but also why did it take that long, to be able to experience that. I think collaboration is hugely important for exhibitors to consider. If you don't have lived experience, if you don't have that knowledge, then doing the research, but also working with those people, whether it's kind of speakers, whether it's consultants, whether it's filmmakers, whether it's local charities and groups and communities. I think collaboration is hugely essential to kind of developing those audiences and actually, hearing it firsthand.
And schools are so important. For some children, going to the cinema on a school trip is the only experience they'll have of going to a cinema. It used to break my heart every time when I'd be introducing films and asking, is this anyone's first time? And up to, the teenage years, you'd get hands up, it was their first time going to a cinema. So if you have the capacity to provide that experience for schools, and you can, there are so many children living in poverty that are in homes where they don't get to do cultural activities. Like if you can work with schools and provide that space and that introduction to this art, this element of culture, like do it.
Absolutely. I think just to kind of start wrapping up, unfortunately, sadly, I suppose I just kind of want to kind of state some, in my opinion, some kind of key pointers. I think consistency and reliability is part of avoiding tokenism, but also building audience trust. I think it's hugely important and understated. So in terms of my context, if you have a subtitle screening like once every 2 weeks, that is not going to build my trust in you as an exhibitor. I think, as we were just talking about, audience development is going to take effort, it's going to take work, and it should take that time and care. And I think exhibitors should be kind of taking a kind of strong, kind of proud stance and be confident whenever any initiatives or practices they're embedding, but also not be defensive and be prepared to listen to any potentially negative feedback or constructive feedback from those audiences that they're trying to improve access for. And like I've already said a million times, but collaboration, hopefully after the session you will go beyond, because we are just 3 speakers and we're not the spokesperson for the communities that we're talking about, and it's just an introductory session, not even an hour long. So it's what you do afterwards And like we say, there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and we'll be sending out the recording and resources afterwards, which will hopefully point you in some directions. But I suppose before we kind of look at questions, is there anything, Kyla or Linnea, you want to kind of add, or really want attendees to take away from today's session?
Think about your values. It sounds was that? I don't mean it in a snidey way. Like, I'm just being like, if you have a mission statement or a vision statement that you have out there, when was the last time you looked at it? And does that vision and mission statement, does it speak to the work that you're doing? Is it embedded in your outreach, your marketing, your programming? If it's not, reflect and figure out what you're going to do about that. Who are you going to talk to make sure that your values and your mission, your vision is suitable for today and the way that people live today, because it's quite different from 10 years ago when you might have last written that statement. Hypothetical venue, sorry, I don't know, you might have written it last week and it's great and that's fab, but if you haven't looked at it in a while, do it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good advice. I feel like I feel like, yeah, just like really delve into the resources that Charlie's going to send out, really delve into what's out there, because there's just such a wealth of information, and so much of it is free. It's really, yeah, start taking, if you haven't before, maybe start thinking about taking responsibility and like looking into that. And nobody's perfect, and if you feel like you've uncovered an area that you haven't thought about before, now's the time to start thinking about it.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the questions here, and we've just had one. Are there any good frameworks for competing needs? For example, when two people or sets of people might have access needs that in some way clash?
That is such a good question.
Yeah, well, that's a great, I love that question. And it is one that I do come across a few times, and I don't have a blanket answer for it other than I think this is where options comes into comes into play, and I know this can be a struggle for exhibitors where they're just showing one screening and they might want that screening to be an accessible format, but they may have other audiences who an example I've thought of is caption screening and audiences who are dyslexic that might not be able to use caption. Kyla, I wonder if you had any kind of thoughts or.
Yeah, sometimes people call this access friction. And I think really, in a way, like, I think, I was non-disabled for the first 15 years of my life, and I'd never really thought about disability or access before I became disabled. And I don't know where I was going with this. It was going to be, poignant, I promise. But I think that when there is like, oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. But one of the things that I've learned so much about, being human from being disabled is about creativity. And when there's access friction, it's an opportunity for creativity. So I'd look at it as an opportunity and not a hindrance.
Yeah, I can in the resource list send across some examples of that. But it is something that I come across, and I think if you are an exhibitor where you're showing multiple screenings, I think it's about kind of having equal opportunities as well. That's just one idea off the top of my head, but I'll send across some resources and thoughts on that as well. Is there any other questions if you want to send them into the Q&A before we wrap up?
Is this when we were supposed to be finishing?
Yes, I just noted the time
Because-
actually. Yes.
I do
Yes,
actually
thank
have
you.
a hard out.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, just noted the time. Okay.
I'm so sorry about that, but
That's all right. Thank you so much, Kyla and Linnea. Put their details up here. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing your experiences. It was a delight to have you both, and thank you so much to everyone that joined today's session. And like I say, we'll send out the recording and some resources there. So thank you so much and take care.
Cheers,
thank
Charlotte.
you.
Cheers,
Thanks,
Kyla.
everyone.
Thanks,
been a pleasure.
everyone.
Bye.